President Trump enters the second half of his term facing many challenges, but is one of the biggest coming from inside his own White House. Joining me now for their first interview, the authors of the new book, Trump's Enemies, How the Deep State is Undermining the Presidency. The president's first campaign manager, Corey Lewandowski, now senior advisor to the Vice President's PAC, Great America Committee, and former Trump deputy campaign manager, David Bossie. David, Corey, welcome back to Fox News Sunday.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
All right. I want to start with the title of your book, Trump's Enemies, in which you include, among his enemies, not only Democrats, but the intelligence community, the administrative state, the media, and the establishment. Corey, is that really how you see the world of politics in Washington? You just heard Ben Sasse call that a warped, weird, lonely view of the world.
Well, I respect Senator Sasse, but what he has to acknowledge is that the attacks that this president has faced since the day that he won the election in November of 2016 have been unprecedented. And those attacks have come from the media, the Republican establishment who never supported candidate Trump and still, by and large, don't support Donald Trump, even though he's taken over the Republican Party, and then many others. And so what we outline, and the intelligence community, and the big part of what we outline in this book is how the intelligence community went after the president through the Pfizer application process and those individuals who worked on the campaign because they simply disagreed with his political philosophy. And that should be a very scary thing for every American.
We're going to get into the Russia investigation in a bit, but you also go after people, David, who are working for the president. You write this: some of the people in the White House, it was now becoming clear, couldn't and shouldn't be trusted, and you name specifically former economic advisor Gary Cohn, former spokesperson Sean Spicer, as members of what you call the November 9th Club, people who turned magically into Trump supporters after he was elected. David, you write that they wanted to control the president instead of, as you said in your first book, to let Trump be Trump.
Exactly. Let me just step back for one moment, and that is, let's remember what is going on here. There's a vast left-wing conspiracy going on that has been going on since the president won this election, all throughout the transition and during his first 2 years. A vast left-wing conspiracy. Very similar words I'm using to what Hillary Clinton called the vast right-wing conspiracy.
Which incidentally didn't turn out to be true.
No, it did turn out. Chris, there was an effort by the conservative movement to undermine President Clinton that led to the impeachment.
But he did have a relationship with Monica Lewinsky.
No, of course he did. But what we're saying here in the book is the media, the Republican establishment, and the intelligence services, not together but separately, are undermining this president, and that is what this book, Trump's Enemies, is about.
But the Republican establishment is not left-wing. The intelligence community is not necessarily left-wing. The administrative state isn't necessarily.
McCabe.
And neither is the
Comey,
media.
Strzok, Page. We can go down the list of all of those within the DOJ and the FBI that undermine this presidency from the beginning. They undermined him during the campaign. They were using illegal operations against him.
But how about the people inside the White House?
Oh, Chris, this is a very important point. Look, we have seen individuals who, my guess is, not only do they not support him when he was running, but probably didn't vote for him on Election Day 2 years ago. Look, I'm sure Gary Cohn didn't vote for him, and there are other people who have been defined as globalists. And there were many individuals who fought hard to get into the White House, who did everything they could prior to him getting elected to keep him from being in the White House. And what we do is we call these people out because it's the right thing to do. The people who didn't support his agenda, and this is not dissimilar from what Melania Trump has said, that there are still people inside the building who they don't trust. And President Trump said in his own interview recently that there are people in the building who he cannot trust. And I hope
and we
that
still
those
don't know who wrote the anonymous letter. I mean, they're clearly, Chris, we don't necessarily know who they are, but there are people inside the White House who understand and are for this president's agenda, and there are those who are there for their own agenda.
All right, Corey, I'm going to ask you about somebody very specific. You, in your book, go after the current White House Chief of Staff, John Kelly, who you say as recently as August wouldn't let the two of you walk around the West Wing without a formal escort. Is Kelly one of the people that you believe is undermining the president?
Well, I respect John Kelly for his service to the country. And as long as the president wants to keep him as his chief of staff, that'll be his prerogative. But to say that Dave and I, two people who have been resolved in our support for the president, to have an escort which almost nobody else has to have, I think is a little bit out of bounds. And look, we have been individuals who support the president's work on television, in op-eds across the board, and to call into question our ability to walk around the campus of the White House, I think is something that should be addressed.
David?
No, it's unfortunate. I completely respect General Kelly, and I respect that the president wants to keep General Kelly there. It is unfortunate that General Kelly doesn't utilize us as much as we think he should. It's his prerogative, and he is in that job, and we respect the job that he has done. I wish that his people. I wish that there were people within the White House structure that cared as much about their own jobs as they did about the midterms, or they cared about the midterms as much as they did their own jobs. The failure of the midterms shows what we left on the table, I think.
I just want to get back to Kelly for a moment. Do you believe that he is one of those people, Corey, who is trying to control the president, channel the president, rather than let Trump be Trump?
Well, I think it's fair to say that we would have very different management styles, and the management style that John implemented when he became the chief of staff was one where to limit the access to the president, to make sure that there is protocols and procedures, and I think candidly that was needed when he came into the White House. But I also think you have a president who wants access to individuals, who wants to take phone calls, and in our book, look, we interview him, and he says, nobody calls me, I don't get my messages. That is a failure somewhere in the staff chain that the president doesn't have the right to get to the people who are trying to reach him. And I don't know where that failure is, but ultimately that should be resolved.
I know you don't want to answer this question, but I'm going to ask you it anyway. Did you get into a physical altercation with John Kelly this last winter that had to be broken up by the Secret Service? Yes or no?
Well, the Secret Service didn't break anything up. John and I had a very candid discussion, as he probably has many times with the president. The difference is...
Did he grab you?
Look, I don't want to get into what John may or may not have done, but what I do think is he understands that my position is to support the president and the president's agenda all the time.
David, you saved your toughest words for the Russia investigation. I want to put up some of what you said. You write, the upper echelons of the intelligence community and federal law enforcement have waged a full-on war against the president. And you say former FBI Director James Comey set in motion a conspiracy that would seek to cause critical damage to the presidency.
I think that that's well established now. I think what James Comey did as FBI director is shameful. I think that I know James Comey long before he was FBI director. I respect him. I respected him for a long time, and I thought he was one of the good guys. What I saw happen inside the FBI, whether it was his field line agents, whether it was Strzok and Page, the McCabe operation, or his leaking of information, or dumping that fake Russian dossier on the table to show then President-elect Trump, that then really spun this out of control. I think he was irresponsible, and I wish that the president had fired him on day one instead of, sometime in May. The president felt like he wanted to give the FBI director a chance, and I think that is unfortunate.
All right, we're running out of time, and I want to get to a couple of more questions. The bottom line issue is whether or not this kind of us versus them view of politics is useful, serves the president, or whether, in fact, it jeopardizes his chances for re-election. And let's take a look at the midterms you talked about. House Democrats picked up at least 38 seats. Suburban women went for Democrats, 57% to 38. Independents supported Democrats, 43% to 33. Corey, there's no question the president's base is rock solid. The question is, he hasn't done enough to expand his base.
Look, I think what the president has done as it relates to the economy and jobs are all going to be a reminder when he's on the ballot. And the individuals who are running in some of these places ran away from the president, which I think was a mistake, particularly in some of those House seats. When you look at where the president campaigned the most, whether it was Georgia or Indiana or in Florida, those candidates were winning time and time again because the Republicans and the independents came out and supported those candidates, which I think by extension was the Trump agenda.
Okay, but there are other places where Republicans didn't win. And I want to talk, let's put this up on the screen. These are places where Republicans lost. Democrats won races for senator and governor in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. David, I don't have to tell you, if the president doesn't carry those 3 states in 2020, he doesn't get reelected.
Well, we're going to make sure that he works hard in those states. We're going to be helping at every step of the way. But if you read our book, Trump's Enemies, and the interview we did with the president talks about the fake news divisions. Not that the media is the enemy of the people, but that the fake news is.
Except he basically says fake news is everybody.
Fake news is all over the place, because if you look at what's gone on across this country, he is, I believe, one of the greatest things, and I agree with the president, one of the great things he's done as president is educate the American people about what's going on in the fake news. And I think he is going up against, you talk about that map, he's going up against the entire establishment of the Washington Democratic Party and the media. He has a big hill to climb, and he is going to do it because he's going to tell the American people about his incredible list of accomplishments and where our economy is.
Corey, David, thank you both. Thanks for coming in. It's always good to talk with you.
Thank you.
Thanks.